So let me just anyway make a quick summary of where we are. We started last evening with some basic ideas. First of all, we do not use the word Jew before 500 AD. There are no Jews in the Bible. We do not use the word Christian before 325 AD. There are no Christians in the Bible. We use Messianists and we use Israelites, Judeans, and the like. When we got to Paul, we are working on Paul's 7 authentic letters. We're not going to do all 7 in our seminar, but we will look at some of them chronologically. Paul was not a Roman citizen. There's no evidence for that in his letters. Paul was not a high-status person. There's no evidence for that in his letters. There is such a report in Luke, but we now know from the notes that Luke is a good piece of literary fiction. It's a spin, it's an interpretation. He was an Israelite, and then 4, he was a persecutor of Messianists. So he himself says that in Galatians chapter 1, verses 12 to 14, and I'm sure it's familiar to you. Starting in 13, you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it, and I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. So this is his statement of what he did. Also continuing in verses 22 to 23, and I was still not known by sight to the churches of Christ in Judea. They only heard it said, quote, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy, end quote. And they glorified God because of me. And I think there's a third one, Acts 7:58, which is Luke's version of what he was up to. This is the death of Stephen. They cast him out of the city and stoned him, and they laid their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And as they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, and then he died. And chapter 8, verse 1, Saul was consenting to his death. And on that day a great persecution arose against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region. Devout men buried Stephen, and in 8:3, Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. So it gives you an idea of how much he hated Jesus and Jesus' followers. He considered Jesus to be an imposter, a deceiver, and that everyone who embraced him as Messiah was completely mistaken and confused, and these people should all be obliterated. Now, then the 5th element about Paul, his identity, is he considered himself to be called by God to be an apostle. So in Galatians chapter 1, going back to Galatians verses 15 to 17, but when he who had set me apart before I was born had called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And what we said yesterday, wherever you see the word Gentiles, don't think people, think geography. It's a land, it's not people. He's going to lands where Israelites are a minority, and that's where he is. So whenever you see that word, it doesn't designate people, it designates geography. Okay, so let me take another look at these verses. He who had set me apart before I was born. What Paul is doing here is alluding to 2 verses, one from Jeremiah and another one from Isaiah. And in both instances, these are statements in which each prophet, Jeremiah and Isaiah, are explaining how they felt selected by God. So by alluding to these elements of the Hebrew scriptures, Paul is aligning himself with the prophetic calling. He considers himself to be an Israelite prophet in the same tradition as Isaiah and Jeremiah. And you probably know from your Old Testament studies that a prophet in the Bible and in the Israelite tradition is a specialist in God's will for the prophets here and now. As you know, the Hebrew language has no future tense. So they don't talk about the future, talk about the forthcoming. Looking at the situation as it is now, that car going 75 miles an hour and there's a truck ahead of it that's parked, he's going to hit it. It's not going to stop. That's not a future prediction, that's forthcoming. Given the velocity of this car, the situation of the truck ahead of it, it's not difficult to say that this is what's going to happen is forthcoming from the events that are already in motion. So Paul aligns himself this way, and as I mentioned yesterday, he didn't convert to Christianity because, first of all, Christianity didn't exist, not till 325 AD. And secondly, conversion is moving from one group to another. Paul never moved. He stayed an Israelite throughout his life till he died. The next item by way of introduction is that Paul was an apostle to Israelites who were living among non-Israelites. So I just gave you those allusions to Jeremiah 1:5 and Isaiah 49:1. And then when I give you those passages, Matthew 10:5, this is Matthew's gospel. In 10:5 he says, don't go to any Gentiles, enter no Samaritan town, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's Jesus' mission command to his apostles. That's Jesus' main interest. It's also Paul's main interest. In chapter 18 of Matthew, verse 17, I think we mentioned that story yesterday too. You and your brother have an argument, try to settle it. If you can't settle it, then get some witnesses, try to settle it. If you can't settle it, take it to the community. If you can't settle it, then with the community and your brother, then consider him a Gentile. It's the worst thing Jesus can call you, a Gentile. Consider him one of those other people, not one of us anymore. And at the very end, and go therefore among all nations, go therefore among the lost sheep of the house of Israel, residing among all nations, and make them disciples. Make them accept Jesus. Try to get them to accept Jesus as Messiah. So Paul considered himself to be an apostle of God. That's how he calls himself. Commissioned to preach the gospel of God. That's what his gospel is about. And so it is something entirely new, something that was never heard by any Israelites before. So what we're doing in our program is using social sciences to try to understand and interpret our Bible. And in social sciences, such a person would be called a change agent. So theologically, we might, or from a biblical point of view, we might call Paul an apostle. But from our point of view, from a modern scientific, social scientific point of view, he's a change agent.